Welcome to the Comic Sauce Podcast, where we talk comics and comics culture. I am Henry Liu, and today I'm joined by Porfirio Rangel. Porfirio, how's it going?
It's going good, Henry. Happy to be here. Happy early Batman Day.
There you go. That's tomorrow, right?
Saturday,
So I
I
believe
think.
it is. I believe it is. We're going to be talking about DC stuff, so it's very appropriate. Thank you, Porfirio. I'm also joined by Christian Diadamo. Christian, how's it going?
Hey, it goes well. Happy early Batman Day. Good way to
Excellent.
start your fall.
Yeah.
Right.
Today is September 19th, 2024, and 2024 brings the 15th anniversary of the Watchmen movie. So that's what we're going to talk about. The Watchmen movie, directed by Zack Snyder. And to moderate the discussion, Christian, take it away.
Hey, all right. So Watchmen. Um, as you said, it released in 2009. This will be the 15th anniversary of this movie. And I think before we get into the movie, I just want to kind of give a quick overview of the comic because the comic, I would say, is one of the most influential and famous graphic novels of all time. It the graphic novel came out in 1986, between 1986 and 1987, written by Alan Moore, also one of the most prolific comic writers of our time, and it was a kind of a dark lens back into superheroes. It took all it was it took a lot of famous superhero DC archetypes and twisted them into say much different ways and humanized him quite a bit. And and so he got that idea from Charlatan Comics. I think I said that right. Charlton Comics. So Charlton Comics came to DC. It was another comic company that was bought by DC in 1986 and brought over characters like Blue Beetle. And so Alan Moore really wanted to use those characters and make a story with them. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to, so he decided to write his own characters. And so the characters of Dr. Manhattan, Night Owl, Silk Spectre, Rorschach, and more were born. And so this came in 1986, and during the pretty much the end of the Bronze Age of comics. The Bronze Age comics started in 1971 when Gwen Stacy died, very famously at the hands of the Green Goblin. And that was the start of comics getting more mature rather than being very directed to young kids. They decided to turn the maturity level up a little bit and start um, writing them for an older audience. And comics like Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns took that and cranked the dial up a little more. The Watchmen was a lot darker, grittier, bloodier than superhero comics had been before. Felt more real and dealt with more mature themes. And so at the time that resonated very heavily with audiences and it became a huge hit both financially and critically and brought into took us out of the Bronze Age and into the modern age of comics, which there definitely is debate on what the name of that age was. You could also call it the Iron Age, but I guess that's another discussion for another day. But anyway, anyways, it was so great, but it was considered unfilmable for many years, pretty much because of how dense it was, how many different characters it had, and how weird it was at the same time. No one thought you could make a movie about Watchmen back in the 80s and the 90s. It wasn't until Zack Snyder took the reins in 2009. Zack Snyder came off was really hot at the time, coming off of 300. And so this was his big follow-up to 300. And so we are here now celebrating this movie and talking about it once again. What's great, what's bad, and of course, with anything Zack Snyder, there's some controversy as well. So,
Yep.
I guess before do you think I covered everything? Is that
Yeah.
anything I missed there? Okay. All right.
I think
So,
we're good.
then why don't we start with us? Did you guys watch the movie back in 2009? Have you guys read the comic? What is your guys' relationship with Watchmen uh, before coming into the movie, or before rewatching this movie today?
I can speak to that. Yeah, I did watch this movie in 2009 in the movie theaters. And yeah, I feel like the release of this movie was a pretty significant moment in my fandom journey, I guess you could say. Um, so yeah, growing up, I grew up reading comic books, particularly Marvel comics, and that was like high school. Like high school, I was really into comic books, and I kind of got away from that in my college years, and then it was really superhero movies that got me back into that fandom. Yeah, like when the X-Men and Spider-Man movies started to come out, I got back into it. But it really wasn't until the Watchmen movie that I got back into reading comic books. Yeah. So whereas there was a pretty, short period of time that I was away from the fandom. It was really just college, I think, for the most part. But the reading comic books, that was a bigger gap. Like that was college and several years afterward. And yeah, like it really wasn't until 2009 with the Watchmen movie that I got back into reading comic books. And it was kind of cool how it happened. Well, I don't know about cool, but interesting how it happened because during that time period, um, I was I wasn't working. I was out of a job. I was looking for work, um, which was kind of stressful and frustrating for me. But it did give me a lot of free time, and I read a lot of comic books. And also during that time, 2009 was a year when WonderCon was in San Francisco at the
Mm.
Moscone Center. And it was like a big deal. Like there was a lot of Hollywood um, stuff at WonderCon in San Francisco for a while, particularly that year. And WonderCon happened in February 2009, right before the Watchmen released the next month in March 2009. So Zack Snyder and like the entire primary cast to Watchmen did a panel that I attended, and it was so awesome. It was so great. They showed a lot of footage, and I just got super hyped. And so yeah, during that period, I just like did a deep dive into Watchmen. I read the entire original graphic novel and just did a lot of research on all things Watchmen. And yeah, I attended that panel at WonderCon and just got like really, really amped up for the movie and enjoyed the movie quite a bit when it did release. So yeah, like I said, a really big part of my fandom journey, and and not the only Watchmen thing that I'm really into. Like I'm basically into all things Watchmen, you know, the original 12 issue series, the Zack Snyder movie, the HBO TV show that came out a few years back, uh, the subsequent Watchmen comics, the before Watchmen prequel series, the Rorschach series, the Doomsday Clock crossover series, which was a little uneven, but I still enjoyed it. But yeah, I'm just a big fan of the entire Watchmen franchise.
Nice. What about you, Porfirio? Have you?
My relationship with Watchmen isn't as interesting as Henry's. Let me just put it like that. Um, when the movie came out back in '09, I was a freshman in high school. I was not an avid comic reader as I am now. But I still loved going to the movies. I was still a big, yeah, like movie going person, and I rented the movie Watchmen when it came out on DVD from Redbox. Um, and I put it on and watched it and fell asleep probably like an hour and a half into it because it is super long and I just did not understand what was going on. Like again, I was only a freshman in high school, so I feel like, I was told that it was a superhero movie, so I kind of expected like I don't know, like X-Men, Spider-Man, Batman kind of film where you have like one superhero and then you have like a villain, they fight, explosions everywhere, bam, bam, bam. And they call it a day. That
Mhm.
was not the case with this movie. That is not the case. So I was pretty bored and yeah, like I said, I fell asleep and never got around to rewatching it until we decided we're gonna do a Watchmen episode for this podcast. So I rewatched it, or no, sorry, I watched it for the first time and I haven't read the comics, I'll say that. But, the first thing that caught my mind was like, oh my gosh, this is a nearly 3-hour movie. I'm gonna have to like watch like parts of it in chunks, whatever. But that was not the case. I watched it, I was super into it, and I sat throughout it in one sitting, and I was just blown away. I was amazed. And I could honestly say there was no way high school freshman me would have appreciated in big bold letters appreciated or understood this film. And I'm so excited to now say that I've watched Watchmen, and now I'm excited to even now join this discussion with you two.
Hey, all
Right
right, that
on.
is quite a turnaround. So for myself, I also watched it in high school, but I was, I think, a senior in high school at the time this came out. And I actually read the comic before. It was a hand-me-down from my sister who gave it to me, and I read it, I think, about a year or two before, and I really liked it. But it is a very subversive comic, and it really is not what you're expecting a superhero comic or superhero movie to be. And just the world that it portrays, the characters, and just the way the plot goes. So I could definitely see where you're coming from, Porfirio, where you turn it on, you expect one thing, and you're like, "What is this?"
hmm
Um, well, let's get into it. Uh, well, first, do you guys have anything in particular you guys want to shout out? What is something you guys really liked about the movie?
I had some thoughts. I guess first we should give the spoiler alert in
Yeah.
case you haven't watched the Watchmen movie. We're gonna get into the details. And I guess specifically we should say we're gonna cover the theatrical cut of this version, of the theatrical cut of this movie, because there also exists a director's cut and an ultimate cut. So commonly with Zack Snyder, there are multiple versions of his movies, right?
How
This is
long are
no different.
those?
Well, the director's cut is just a little bit longer, and the ultimate cut is like ridiculously long.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's that. Um, yeah, the ultimate cut, I mean, it's a bit too much, I think. But
hmm
I think the director's cut is worth checking out. There's definitely some interesting things in there
Okay.
that you don't get in this version, the theatrical cut. So we're going to talk about the theatrical cut here. Um, but yeah, the thought that I had was it is interesting that you, Porfirio, um, found that the movie didn't resonate with you when you first saw it, but it did subsequently. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me because the comic book series, the original comic book series, The Watchmen, was like something you could not have read. You can't read that without having read a lot of superhero comics beforehand.
hmm
Like if you
hmm
just dove into Watchmen without reading a lot of superhero comics beforehand, I mean it's a great graphic novel, but I it it, it really I
It's
don't think
heavy.
it yeah, it's heavy and I think you really need to have read a lot of superhero comics
Uh-huh.
because it brings up all like Christian you were saying the archetypes and it plays off of like the mythology of superheroes, right?
hmm
And then the movie, same thing, right? You can't watch this movie without having seen a lot of superhero movies. And when you first got your first taste of this movie, you hadn't seen a lot of superhero movies yet, right? For you, you've seen a shit ton since then. So to me, it makes sense that now the Watchmen movie resonates with you, right? It
hmm
does really touch a nerve. And yeah, I've heard the original comics described as the moment comic books grew up. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And one could argue that this movie sort of signals a moment where superhero movies grew up, right? So I don't think they could have made this movie like right after the comics came out, like, I don't know, early 90s or something. But when it came out in 2009, like by then we got the whole like Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. We got a bunch of X-Men movies. We got the Burton Batman movies
hmm
and the MCU had just kicked off like the year before. So like superhero movies were like a thing and this movie like really I think speaks to people who saw a lot of superhero movies and they're ready for a story like this, right? So yeah, that's the first thing I would say is a big plus for people who are into this stuff. Like it works well as like a superhero story, but like you were alluding to earlier, Christian, it subverts a lot of that. And it's just so fascinating. You can enjoy it like on multiple levels as a, a social commentary, a straight up superhero story you can enjoy. Um, and yeah, a complete subversion and deconstruction of superhero mythology.
Ooh, yeah. I like that. Yeah, it does really subvert a lot of expectations, a lot of tropes, a lot of archetypes, plot lines, and in a lot of ways that like I really didn't expect the first time I watched it, the first time I read it. And you're right, that is really what makes it great. Uh, so like, well, I think the first thing that I think we keep talking about, the way it subverts is really the archetypes. So, I think I even mentioned it before. You have Doctor Manhattan, who's your Superman. You have Night Owl, Batman, Silk Spectre is Wonder Woman. Um, as your kind of main three, your Trinity, so to speak. And so, let's see. Is there a specific character that, like, I think really spoke to you, a character that really you guys related to the most, or just, a personal favorite within the story? Any particular character shout outs?
I think for me, when I first saw this movie, I think 'cause his image was the first one you see like on a poster. Um, the first character that caught my attention was Rorschach. You know,
Hmm.
he
Yeah.
he's just this character you don't he has this like mystery behind him because he has his mask and blob moving around, you know. You don't again like this was just me talking back like as a freshman, like the term superhero I just thought was like, someone in bright colors, like Spider-Man, Superman, not the X-Men live action, X-Men animated series, bright colors, you know. Um, so for me, when I first saw this movie, I thought Rorschach was an interesting character. I was like, okay, this is interesting because this is a superhero movie, and again, like I think he's like one of the first heroes that you're introduced to. I mean, obviously, yeah, there's the comedian's assassination at the beginning of the film, but I feel like I believe Rorschach was the first one who is like actually introduced for the plot line.
Yeah.
And then um when I first just saw the story being played out, like him and his violent um ways of getting information, I was like jaw drop like what am I watching? This is
Yeah.
what like he's not your typical superhero. And so rewatching it, I I remember just having those thoughts when I first saw it, and I was just so rewatching it, I was like, okay, who is this guy? Like, who is he really? And he's this guy who just fucking like doesn't trust anyone and questions everything, you know?
Yep.
And he is, yeah, probably not the hero, is the person, is the identity I would identify him with, but he's this dude who just wants to get the truth and seeks for good no matter the boundary.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Right on.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's funny you mentioned Rorschach, Porfirio, because I remember before I read the comics or saw the movie, that was the character that caught my eye also. Like, yeah, I didn't read the comics until around when the movie came out. But I was like peripherally aware of the Watchmen, and I saw some images of them, and I kind of thought they looked sort of cheesy, like kind of corny looking superheroes, except for Rorschach. Like I remember saw him, I'm like, oh, that guy looks cool. And when I did read the comics and first saw the movie, he was like my favorite character. He's like he looked super cool and he had this code, right? He completely uncompromising vision of justice, right?
Hmm.
Um and like yeah, it's funny. Then I thought he looked super cool. I thought he was cool. But like now, like I just watched this movie again a couple nights ago. I've seen it a lot over the years, but particularly now, Rorschach is like pretty scary. He's like he's a total menace, and he takes things way too far, and he's probably more of a villain than a hero, right? Um, so now I would say I identify much more with the Night Owl character. Um, yeah, like when I was younger, I felt like night owls like kind of a pussy, like, he's just a whiny guy. He's like out of shape and his best days were behind him and stuff. And but now like I definitely relate to him. Like he's like a voice of reason in a way, right? Um yeah, I feel for him. He's very relatable. Like he's sort of torn between wanting to live a quiet normal life but still yearns for like suiting up and being a hero, right? And he wants to do the right thing, and he just struggles with everything, the world around him and the situations he's been put in. And I think he's pretty cool too. He's got a cool costume and he's got cool gadgets, and he has the appeal of a Batman type character for sure. So yeah, that's who I relate to most now, and I would say, yeah, my favorite character of the main Watchmen characters is Night Owl.
You know, Henry, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like Night Owl, I got like kind of like a Captain America kind of vibe, like he, like you said, he wants to do good, but he doesn't want to cross that boundary,
Yeah,
of having like blood on his hands or like do things within the law, you
yeah,
know. But he's just a little bit more not a Boy Scout like than Captain America.
yeah. I mean, if you were to pick like the Boy Scout character of the Watchmen, he'd be it,
Oh,
right?
for
So
sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right in that comparison. But like every other character in this movie, um, there's a lot of gray area and a lot of darkness in the characters,
Hmm.
obviously, right?
Hmm.
Well, another thought that came to mind is, we brought up the boys earlier, and I think there are a lot of parallels with Watchmen and the boys. Um, both franchises, I think, tell a story where um, you get the question answered, what if superheroes existed in real life, right?
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
wouldn't be like the characters you see in Marvel movies or in DC movies, right? They'd be more like these characters, right? And I think with the boys, it's like if superheroes really existed, they would be complete assholes, right? With Watchmen, I think it's more like if superheroes really existed, they would be highly mentally disturbed, right? They would have a lot of mental issues. And I think that's something that all the Watchmen characters have. They got some mental issues going on for sure,
Y-
to say the least.
yes, they do. And I think a character that I think has grown on me, like someone I wouldn't even say I relate to this character, but Dr. Manhattan, I think, is a character that I just the more I rewatch him, the more interesting I find the character because he starts as a regular guy, but getting these godlike powers that pretty much go beyond Superman. Like we see him just create matter on Mars. And so he becomes less and less human as you see his story progress. He doesn't age. He doesn't like he's just blue. Doesn't really care about any clothes. Like he kind of it's almost like humanity is a bit of a burden, a sense of
Hmm.
shackle to him, and that the idea of being Superman, he's not even after a while, his perspective on reality has changed so much that he's not even a man anymore. He
Yeah,
becomes this entirely otherworldly being who just doesn't really care about the problems and the plight of the average person. Very unlike you know Superman or any superhero.
yeah,
And though there's like an entire very long conversation between him and Silk Spectre on Mars where he has to be convinced to save the world.
Right.
and he asks Silk Spectre to convince him because he's so far gone from reality, or the human perspective of reality,
Mhm.
that it just doesn't mean people on Earth just doesn't really mean anything to him.
Yeah.
And so I'm not even gonna say that's relatable, and like you could say he out of all the characters, he might have the most mental problems
Yeah.
or the least. But
Yeah.
I think that was something that I think also kind of struck me. It strikes me a little more and more, I think, when I come back to it
Yeah.
as well. So, like, each of these characters, are great. It feels like we could write just like an essay on each of them, and I think
Yeah.
that's what makes Watchmen so well done.
Yeah.
It takes that. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't even think it was the first time a creator had an idea of what if we took the Justice League but made them different,
Yeah.
similar to say the way the Boys does with the Seven, and the way we've seen just many other series do that. Marvel's done that too with with different DC characters. Um, so I think next up, let's see. Um, uh-oh. Do you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Sorry.
Good.
We'll cut that part. It looked like my screen froze for a minute.
Okay.
So, I get sorry, Henry, I just have to cut a little part out of there about what 20 minutes, 25 minutes in.
No worries.
Okay. So, where was I? Okay. Um,
Hey, but
well,
real
oh,
quick
yeah.
on just a quick follow-up on Dr. Manhattan. I love what you mentioned. He is a very interesting character. And even though he's got like powers, yeah, there is this odd relatability to him. And I think it does dive into something we don't really get into with other superheroes. Like if you are that powerful, at some point you're going to get bored, right? At first it'll be exciting. Dr. Manhattan started off wearing clothes and like helping the United States win the Vietnam War. But then he just started to get really bored with humans, and
Mhm.
he just started to want to study biology on Mars, right? And I think there's got to be some truth to that, right? If you're that powerful, it's gonna get old pretty quick, right? So I think there's a lot of truth in that character, and we just don't see that elsewhere. And I think, yeah, it does speak to something that I think would happen eventually with someone that powerful. You would just get bored, and superheroes being bored does not generally make for good
Mhm,
comic book storytelling. But like I've been saying, I think there's some truth to that, and it's just interesting. And like I agree, like the characters in Watchmen are so fascinating. Like I love all the characters. Like I could go on and on about like all of them, So like there's great character development in this movie, and I'm completely on board with all the characters. I agree with some of what they do. I disagree with some of what they do, but ultimately I'm completely like gripped by like their stories. I want to know like how they all end up. Love it.
mhm. Well, with that, I'd say let's talk about, I think, one of the quote unquote villain of the story, Ozymandias.
Mm,
Here to give the spoiler warning.
yeah.
So he is the smartest man in the world, and he is the one that essentially destroys New York in order to quote unquote achieve world peace, achieve peace between the U.S. and Russia. Whereas throughout the story, um, the people are generally talking about how they're pretty much at the edge of doomsday. They're just waiting for these nukes to come and all of them to die. And that's a continuous theme. They go a lot farther into it in the comic book than the movie, but it is a very present theme of just the threat of nuclear war bearing down on the general population. And so Ozymandias's solution to this is to, well, let's create a new enemy. if we give them a new enemy and blow up New York, then that will achieve world peace.
Mhm.
So, what do you guys think of Ozymandias, his plan, and whether maybe he was right or maybe he was wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question to ask this around the room here. Number one, is Ozymandias the villain of this movie? And was he right? Did he do the right thing? Like, there's a
Mm.
lot of gray area, but
Mhm.
yeah. Oh, Porfirio, seems like you have some thoughts here.
No, you go first, Henry.
I go first.
I want to hear what other people have to say before
I thi-
I.
okay. I mean, this is so fascinating because when I was first exposed to this storyline, it really was like, what the fuck? Like, oh my God. I thought like Rorschach's detective work and all this like planning by our heroes would lead to them like defeating Ozymandias, as we've seen time and again in superhero stories, right? But they get their asses kicked and Ozymandias is victorious and then it's like, oh, and the world is better off because of it? Like, what the fuck? I was completely like thrown for a loop. Um, so I was confused and just like, I don't know, kind of angry and I don't know, just like many feels, right? Um, so I did really struggle with that question. Like, was what he did the right thing? Because it really paints the picture that if he didn't do what he did, then the world would have ended. The nukes would have been fired and goodbye Earth. I think more so in the comics, actually. Like in the movie, it kind of implies that if he didn't um, drop his weapon of mass destruction, that probably the US and the Soviets would have fired their rockets at each other and the Earth would have been destroyed. Um, but it's just sort of implied. I think in the comics, it really was like it would have definitely happened. Um, in the movie, it's a little bit more speculation. Um, so, okay, that's the first thing, right? So, what did his actions save the planet? And then the second one was, is the is the Earth better off for him doing what he did, right? So the first part, okay, well, I mean, let's put the comics aside because that we could go all day with that, I think. But with the movie, it seems like it's not a for sure thing. Like maybe the nukes would have been fired if he hadn't have done that, but maybe not. So benefit of the doubt, let's say like it wouldn't necessarily have happened. And then there's the question that the second question I posed: is the world better off for what he did? He sacrificed millions to quote unquote save billions. Sounds familiar, right? That's like straight out of Winter Soldier, right? We just talked about that on our last podcast. That's
Mhm.
what um, the Robert Redford character was going for, right? He wanted to sacrifice millions to save billions, right? But no, that's the wrong thing to do. You don't murder millions of people. That's genocide, right? But here it's like, oh, well, you see at the end, like, oh, things are pretty good, like Silk Spectre and Night Owl are hanging out and having fun, and you even see like some electric vehicles, I think, and Ozymandias's like renewable energy sources seem to be taking effect, and it seems like, oh, did this work out? Um, so then, okay, another slight tangent. I thought a bit about the pandemic we just went through. So oddly, I got the answer to my question about Watchmen from real life in a way, because basically what Ozymandias was trying to do is create a common threat to the world so the world would come together, right?
Mhm.
And that's what happened at the end of this movie, right? Um, the US and the Soviets put their rockets down and they're like, okay, we need to get along. We learned our lesson. And seemingly there's this utopia, right? Like I think Rorschach even refers to it as Ozymandias's utopia, right? Um, but would it last? Would the peace and harmony last, right? And I think we got our answer with the real life uh, COVID-19 pandemic. No, it's a resounding no, because we ourselves faced a global common threat. And when it happened, maybe because of stories like Watchmen, I thought the world was going to come together and work with each other and unite and work towards a peaceful coexistence. But quite the opposite happened. We saw more division in our society and more anger and more hatred. And I think this whole idea of the greater good, sacrificing the few to save the many, is it, it is not a feasible solution, right? We've seen it, like we mentioned the Winter Soldier movie. They tried it there. Thanos tried that with the Infinity Saga in a different way. But it's not. I think it's not a good solution. And like I've been saying, we have real life evidence now because COVID was that moment, right? To me, it's like, okay, this is what I've been seeing in movies and TV shows and comic books all these decades. This is happening for real. Are we going to have this moment where we're all going to come together and unite against this common threat? No, it didn't happen. Sadly, it did not happen. So, is Ozymandias right? I would say no.
Ooh, all right. Yeah. What do you think, Porfirio? Do you think Ozymandias was right?
You go first, Christian. I'm still trying to.
You're still
I'm, s-
processing.
I'm
Well,
still.
it's hard. It's a tough question with
It's a very tough question.
and
Yeah.
there's a lot that you have to like generally infer. I think a
Mhm.
lot of from real world things.
Mhm.
I think an important thing to remember as well is that Watchmen is like they go a lot into the United States politics and ways
Mhm.
that it has changed
Mhm.
because of superheroes, because of Doctor Manhattan. Vietnam went very differently for the United States, and they just outright won rather than what happened. The messier ending that we got in real life, and the way the Cold War went was going very differently because this was made in 1986, whereas in 1989 is when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. And so those and so while the idea of nukes going off and Russia launching nukes was a very big problem back in the 80s, of course, looking back now, we know that never happened. We know that the Soviet, we know of what really happened and that but of course, with that being said, will people unite against a common enemy? I also think, it can be an overly simplistic way to kind of look at things, that
Mhm.
that's the only thing that will truly bring us together, that that is the only thing that will bring nations together. And that Ozymandias said utopia. And I think that's something that kind of relationship like that can only be tenuous at best. The
Yep.
even though the US and Russia are big players, but or the big political players in the comic book as major enemies, but as we know, World War II, the United States and Russia were allies against the common threat of the Nazis and the Axis powers,
Mhm.
which even though they may have and that alliance lasted for only a short time. It was
Mhm.
only for that war. So
Mhm.
I don't think there's really a way that they would have had peace for like any sort of extended period of time before um they kind of got more so back into old habits. We still see political problems like to this day that we are seeing currently in 2024 on the news between the United States and Russia that we've been seeing for the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way, I think Ozymandias did something that probably could have been very short-sighted. The ends probably don't justify the means, justify the means, and that the solution would have only been shorter. Maybe it, and who knows if. I guess we do see what happens in the show later,
Mhm.
but maybe that doomsday. You see, well, that doomsday scenario might just come back later on,
Mm-hmm.
even though they are friends now against this common enemy.
And
So no.
a quick aside, yeah, a note from you as well. But a quick aside there. Yes, the TV show does tell like the continuation of the Watchmen story, as does the Doomsday Clock comic series. And in both cases, they share our sentiment that, well, it was a temporary good situation. The world still ended up getting fucked up later. So just furthering the argument that Ozymandias was not necessarily right here.
Yeah, so definitely 2 no's. Ozymandias is definitely the villain. But, here's also another question. Would you if you were in that situation, let's say you're in the room with the Watchman at that pretty much Fortress of Solitude with Ozymandias, and he unveils his plans, would the right thing do you guys think the right thing would be to tell the world, to go to the press and say, "Hey, Ozymandias did this," or would you take that lie to your grave? That's
Ooh,
the final
good,
dilemma that the Watchmen face.
good
You see,
question.
Rorschach dies because he is not taking that to the grave. He just runs out there to go tell press, but of course, Night Owl, and Silk Spectre, and Doctor Mayhem kind of begrudgingly accept it, accept that. Well,
Yep,
would this undo? Is that really the right thing to do?
that's a
So yeah,
tough one.
yeah, that is a tough question.
That's heavy.
It's a
Okay,
tough
well,
moral question.
okay, I guess let me walk a few steps back to the previous question you said. Um, you know, I okay, like I understand, yeah, where Ozymandias was coming from, and maybe, yeah, it would have been a good like short term um solution, like Henry said, but I think I'm sorry, I'm a cynical person and I just have the least hope and belief in humans, and I just feel like we as humans crave and always want violence. We get bored really easily
Hmm.
with peace,
Yeah,
and we always want violence because it in some cynical way in us, it's a form of entertainment. Like,
yeah.
I don't want to get too deep into it because, like, I mean, even like, I'm just thinking like us kind of like liking like superhero archetypes. Like, yes, we like them because they are supposed to be the beacon and symbols of hope and justice, but they have to do that with like fighting or doing some kind of physical interaction instead of like quote unquote talking resolution. Like that's like that's not gonna sell a comic. We'll be bored as fuck reading that,
Yep.
And so I feel like we as humans always crave violence, and even like that final scene in Watchmen, like there's that newspaper editor who's just like, nothing's going on. We can't write about anything. Nothing's happening.
Hmm.
And he's just like, pick a story from that like pile to write something about. Like nothing's happening. Like it's boring. It's a slow day. Like he's complaining that there's peace, because he's
Right.
bored.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, like Henry, you brought up an interesting take that we will get bored and we'll find, if it's not Dr. Manhattan, we'll find another reason to be upset at Russia or another country and find a reason to initiate conflict.
Yeah.
So, and then going back to Christian's follow-up question, I think that I don't know, that's also a hard one. Because on one hand, like if people know the truth, that's gonna, I feel like, cause more harm than um resolution, you know?
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
people will just be angry. They'll be in their emotions. They wouldn't think this logically. They wouldn't be like, "Oh, this person killed this person because they wanted to do this." Like they wouldn't have that like simple logic mindset. Like human emotion is not black and white. And I feel like that would just cause more harm than good. So maybe it's not a bad thing if secrets are kept. Um, but I don't know. It's a hard that's a hard question to answer. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think? Before I start rambling on and I become too philosophical with this.
Well, I did have a thought, and it's kind of like hindsight is 2020 in a way, because seeing what happened to Rorschach, of course you don't want to announce to everyone like I'm gonna tell the world the truth, right? Because he's
Hmm.
he's killed on the spot, right? So
Hmm.
maybe you keep your mouth shut initially, at least, right? But yeah, maybe you hold on to that information and then see if it is of benefit to reveal the truth at a later time, perhaps, right? So, as we've seen, um, these these solutions can be temporary, like we've been saying, right? So, when things inevitably start to unravel, maybe you pick the right time to tell your story. Yeah. So maybe that's the right approach, to reveal the truth to the world, but only at the perfect time.
Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, that might be what I do too now that I hear. It's definitely a hard question, and I think that's what makes Watchmen so revolutionary and beloved, is that
Yeah.
especially before in superhero comics, you wouldn't get that kind of question. You wouldn't get
No.
that kind of moral dilemma
Yeah.
where you kind of wonder what really is the right thing. Who is the protagonist and the antagonist here?
Yep.
Whereas before everything, and of course, since then, I mean, a lot of mainstream superhero comics, movies, media, you get that like black and white, bad guy wants to destroy the city for
Hmm.
some ridiculous reason or no reason at all, and the superhero stops them and saves the day.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what makes Watchmen so great. They don't save the day, but what decision do they make after? What really
Yeah.
is the right thing to do?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think if I were, I'd be like stunned if I were in that shoes. I think when
Yeah.
if you're in that room, you just like you don't know what to do,
Yeah.
and so maybe I probably would keep my mouth shut, especially initially. I think that's a massive weight on your shoulders as well. So
Yeah.
I think that might be something you just reveal so much later in time after you see the way the world just plays out,
Yeah.
because that's such a revealing would be such a wild card. You have no idea what the implications are going to be.
Yep. And hey,
I know.
furthering on all that, even though all three of us are in agreement that Ozymandias was not necessarily right, I think we can all agree that we understand why he did what he did. He was the hero of his own story, right? He's saving the world, right? If you look at it from the point of view that nuclear war is imminent, like he has to do this. Like he has to take, this sort of drastic action, right? Um, in retrospect, like, whoa, it was way too much, and we're saying like, oh, it's just like a temporary fix, but a temporary fix to worldwide annihilation is still better than anything, right? Because what's the alternative? The human civilization ends, right? So yeah, and that's what's so great. Like, not with just the Ozymandias character, but you really understand why these characters do what they do. You understand their motivations, and it makes for really compelling storytelling.
Yeah, very well said. All right. Well, think we haven't actually talked about things we didn't like. I guess we'll move on from this very heavy philosophical discussion into something
There we go.
probably a little later. Unless you guys had anything else you really like that you just want to call out.
Oh, I did have a call out, and this might be a good transition to the negatives, but Zack Snyder. This is a film directed by Zack Snyder, who has, is a controversial figure, has gotten a lot of criticism over the years, and this is no question a Zack Snyder movie. There's a lot of slow-mo. There is a lot of seriousness. It's a grim movie. Um, this was technically his first DC movie, and he would go on to direct many more DC movies, all in this vein. A lot of slow-mo, very serious. Um, but I wanted to give him kudos. Like, I thought this movie looked awesome. Like, the visuals in this movie are great, and I was kind of wondering how well it would hold up. Watched it a couple of days ago, and I thought it looked fantastic. I thought visually it really holds up. It looks great. And yeah, like yeah, just aesthetically, I think it's a huge win for Zack Snyder. So a big plus for me in that department.
Yeah, I agree. The style is really good, and I think he did do a really good job. I guess, since we were talking about it, I will say, I like there's a change at they changed the end of the movie slightly with whereas in the comics the dark yeah, not Dr. Manhattan is the big bomb that destroys New York. Ozymandias sets off this massive EMP blast that everyone thinks is Dr. Manhattan, and the world unites against Dr. Manhattan. Whereas in the comics, uh, it's really a giant alien that Ozymandias manufactures and teleports into New York. And I'm not sure how well that would have worked in the movie. There's a lot of buildup in the comics to this giant alien, and you get a
Hmm.
lot more of just the regular street folk as well. So you build up more of that doomsday device. And so I think this was Dr. Manhattan was a nice compromise to kind of streamline the idea, where something that might have been a touch too far, I think, for a lot of people
Mhm.
who hadn't
Yeah.
read the comic or might just think that would have been a little too weird. So I
Yeah.
think that gets the same message across, but streamlines it pretty well. So and that I think Zack Snyder did a pretty good job with this. And I think for something unfilmable, I think overall he did, or what was deemed unfilmable, he did a pretty good job. But I think with that, let's go to the negatives, which probably
Sure.
will go back to Zack Snyder. So, anything you guys want to call out for something you didn't like about this movie?
Real quick follow-up on what you mentioned about the alien monster. Yeah, I mean, I understand why they changed the ending. Like you're saying, Christian, it was just too weird. Right? That would have been very weird. Um, so I understand why they did that. There was one thing that I caught that was a little bit odd because they changed that, right? So in the comics, the comedian becomes completely unraveled and mentally unstable because of what he discovers. He discovers what Ozymandias is up to, and he actually sees like a tentacled creature, and he like fucking loses his mind, right? That makes sense in the comics, right? But in the movie, you see him in a flashback kind of like crying and babbling at Moloch's apartment, right? And we're not sure exactly what is going on, but it's implied that like he um discovered Ozymandias's plan and sort of loses his mind. But like in the end, like I don't really know why he would completely go overboard like that. Like in the comics, it makes sense because he actually saw the alien creature, right? But in the movie, there was no alien creature. So I'm not sure why. There's a bit of a disconnect there. Yeah.
Ah, yeah, I forgot
Yeah.
about that.
So there's that. Side note, Jeffrey Dean Morgan as the comedian in this movie is so fucking good. I think he might have the best acting performance of them all. He is amazing, and that almost made up for the fact of that little disconnect I mentioned. But there is that slight disconnect I would call out, as, maybe as a minor gripe with the
Mhm.
movie. But to answer your question about any problems with the movie and Zack Snyder in particular. I mentioned how visually the movie was great, but this criticism has come up before where some folks feel like the movie was maybe too faithful an adaptation of the comics. So we mentioned like there's the lack of the alien creature at the end. That's about it. Like there is very little that this movie uh you know diverted from the comics, yeah. Um and some say it was too close. And with a different medium, when you're adapting a comic book into a movie, you have to adapt, right? Um a lot of celebration has happened with Marvel Studios and how well Marvel Studios has adapted comic book stories into movies and uh, to an extent television. Um, but yeah, the criticism is that Zack Snyder like he held the original material in too high uh, a like he held it in too high of an esteem, and he was afraid to adapt it. Yeah. And I can see that a bit, like there were a couple moments where I felt like, whoa, like they used the dialogue verbatim from the comics, and it felt a little bit like lacking realism a bit. So uh, you know Zack Snyder's famous for BVS, and there's that the Martha moment, right?
Mhm.
Like, why'd you say that name, right? And it's a lot of people make fun of it because it seems kind of silly, and like, in real life, like that wouldn't happen, right? So there's some stuff in Watchmen I feel like is in that vein, like um so there's a scene with Silk Spectre and Night Owl just going out to dinner, hanging out. And at the end of the evening, Silk Spectre says, there don't seem to be many laughs around these days. And Night Owl says, what do you expect? The comedian's dead. And it just felt like this is not something like real people would actually say, right? And it's like directly from the comics, and it's almost like poetic, like the way Alan Moore wrote it, and it works like in the comic book medium, but like in a movie is like it just doesn't seem realistic, Um, Similarly, there's that scene where the comedian and Night Owl are doing crowd control and this protest, and Night Owl says, like after the comedian has like completely like terrorized these protesters, Night Owl says, "What happened to the American dream?" And the comedian says, "It came true. You're looking at it, right?" And again, it just like it felt very like not genuine, not something a real person would say. And we're talking about a superhero story with like godlike powers with Dr. Manhattan. But there's a big appeal of the Watchmen story is that there is some relatability to it because it is a story where it is answering the question of what if superheroes existed in real life. And if these characters existed in real life, I like dialogue like what I just mentioned wouldn't be like that. It just feels it doesn't feel real, and it belongs in a comic book, but not necessarily in a movie. Yeah, so that's just my opinion there.
Mhm. And I definitely share some along that sentiment. I think with mine criticism that is very similar to that, I would say it's almost in the while I do kind of enjoy the style, Zack Snyder very goes for this very like stylized look and feel to this movie, very similar to 300, which came out a few years earlier, which at the time that was, that movie was a big hit,
Yeah,
and that's what he was really known for. And and so he brought a lot of that over stylization to Watchmen. And there's a part of me I've also heard a criticism that I kind of definitely see, especially watching it this time, that the movie is too over stylized and kind of goes against that kind of realistic grit. And I
hmm
think like and while it's a very pretty movie to look at, and some of the action is very well choreographed and shot, sometimes it feels a bit out of line with how you remember some scenes from the comics, and how like I think the message kind of gets a little bit diluted. You're supposed to see these heroes as regular people, but you also kind of see them get into these like big kung fu fights, and you see they always have to amp up the action with these big slow-mo moments when really it probably didn't call for that. The scene probably didn't call for that. I could see the studio throwing in a mandate of, hey, we need a little more action in the superhero movie because it's a superhero movie, but it does seem a little bit odd, and sometimes some action bits did come off as a little corny. I think the final fight between Ozymandias, Night Owl, and Rorschach seemed to there was a part where I was like, okay, this is a little much. This is going on for a little too long. Whereas I really don't remember that. It's been a while since I've seen that in read the comic, but I was like, man, I really don't remember any of that in the comic. Like, I remember the walk into the throne room and Ozymandias telling the plan and saying that he executed it 25 minutes ago or 35 minutes ago. And whereas they have to have this whole fight as where you think, well, you have this guy who's supposed to be out of shape, and you have like the smartest man in the world who's not probably not known for his physical prowess as much, getting into these over stylized fist fights at the end of the movie. And it feels like it kind of glorifies things that really glorifies characters that probably should be more humanized, you know? You're not really you're supposed to empathize with these characters, but not hold them up to superhero levels like you would Batman, Superman. But the movie kind of does that in a way. It's kind of what you were saying, Henry, with Zack Snyder treating maybe treating this, this comic is well, it's a little too holy. So, but that's my take. Do you have anything, Porfirio? Anything that bothered you about this movie?
Um, I don't know if it's like so much the material, um, but I think that this movie was just really long. You know, I said that in the beginning, and I just think something like the Watchmen comics, like this was just like translated better as like a TV show. You know, I feel like there are just some like pieces of literature, like whether it be in comics, novels, whatever, that are just really complex and you really need to flesh out like the themes and characters that you can't fit that on a 2 hour movie. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think this would have just translated so much better as like an 8 episode TV show or something like that. Um, and because again, I'm just thinking of like as a consumer that, and how I told you guys in the beginning, like, oh my gosh, this is 3 hours. Like, I'm gonna have to watch like this in 2 sittings, you know?
Yeah.
And again, maybe like thinking like if I saw this in theaters, man, would I have to like hold in my pee if I had to use the bathroom, whatever. And like you said, Henry, like if you missed anything, you're like screwed because every little detail is vital to understanding the plot line and theme of the movie. And so I just feel like this just would have translated so much better on a TV show format than a movie format to just
Mm.
flush out all these themes and um the symbolism in that the Watchmen's supposed to represent.
That's a good take.
That's just me.
Yeah, I could see that. Like, I do think the HBO show kind of does it does a lot of justice to that,
Mm-hmm.
and it is, like you said, like, just like a mini series
hmm
Yeah.
that really takes its time and
And if not a TV show, then at least like a, I mean, I know some people hate it, but I think like this would have made an exception, like a two-part or trilogy of the film. Like I
Mm.
know that's been notoriously hated among fans, like when they did of The Hobbit and the last Harry Potter film,
Yeah.
um, book. But I think with Watchmen, it's kind of necessary because it's just so complex and there's
Mm-hmm.
just so much going on that you just need time to breathe and process everything that's being fed to you.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Hey, that brings up an interesting point. You know, we're talking about the 15th anniversary of this movie. It's worth mentioning the the context of when the movie was released, right?
hmm
So now, like the year 2024, it would have made a lot more sense to release this as a TV series, right? You mentioned 8-part Porfirio. I would argue 12-part because there were 12 comic books in the original
Oh,
Watchmen
okay.
series.
hmm
They could have had an episode for each comic. It would have been kind of
hmm
perfect, right? But this is 2009, right? It was
hmm
just not a thing, right? TV was a whole different animal back then. There was no streaming, and
hmm
they just didn't do stuff like this on TV.
hmm
And you mentioned the trilogy, like a multi-part movie series. That was a thing, but with a particular kind of movie, right? They would
hmm
not have greenlit a Watchmen trilogy, right? It just would not have happened, right? Like they did with Lord of the Rings or whatever, right? Star Wars. It just it's just Watchmen wasn't that kind of property, yeah. Um, and there's no way that Zack Snyder would have been like, okay, let's do part 1 of 3 and let's hope it's successful enough so we can do more. Like, no, this is the only path that this gets made, right? A singular movie in 2009. So yeah, it is interesting to speculate, like, oh, what if this if this movie hadn't been made and they were considering a Watchmen adaptation now, probably, like, in my mind, it probably would have been a TV show, yeah. But just back then, this is like the only possible game in town. And kudos to Zack Snyder. I think the movie's not perfect, but I think it really was as good as it could be. We've been saying, like, this is the unfilmable comics story. But like, I think it's, yeah, seeing it this week, I feel like, man, this is about as good as it could have been. Yeah.
Hint, Christian froze.
Oh,
Oh, well, I think or would you guys just wanna get right to, our ratings?
oh, let's see. Oh, just a real quick mention, just because I wrote it down. If anyone's curious about the original Charlton characters that were supposed to be in this story. So we mentioned Blue Beetle. Yeah, the Night Owl character was supposed to be Blue Beetle. The Rorschach character was supposed to be The Question, which notably is a Steve Ditko creation, a post-Marvel Steve Ditko. Dr. Manhattan was supposed to be Captain Atom. Ozymandias was supposed to be this character named Thunderbolt. Silk Spectre was supposed to be a character called Nightshade. Nightshade also notably was a Steve Ditko creation. And then, very interestingly, the comedian was originally supposed to be Peacemaker. So Peacemaker was a Charlton superhero. And like we've been saying, Charlton was acquired by DC. That's why the Peacemaker exists in the DC universe now. So yeah, that's a pretty cool what if also, right? What if DC allowed Alan Moore to use those characters and that was the story, right? That would have been pretty wild. Um, Probably would have been pretty similar because my understanding is that um, the story would have been the same. It's just that he would have had these original Charlton characters. So kind of a cool what if. Oh, and
Yeah.
just side note, the the Nightshade character, I guess Alan Moore wasn't that interested in. So all the characters I mentioned, like, are like basically a direct adaptation. Like, the comedian is Alan Moore's adaptation of Peacemaker. Night Owl is his adaptation of Blue Beetle. The one exception, I guess, is Silk Spectre, where Silk Spectre ended up being more influenced by other DC properties, the Phantom Lady and Black Canary. I've heard that those two characters were more influences on the Silk Spectre character than Nightshade, who was the original character he had in mind. So some interesting nuggets there. And again, that's a big what if. Like, what if he got to use those characters? That would have been pretty wild.
I have a question. I don't know if either of you guys can answer it, but I read that Alan Moore didn't want to be credited to be involved in any way with this film. Do you know why?
Um, Alan Moore does not like this comic book.
He doesn't?
No, he doesn't like that. He doesn't like the Killing Joke. He really does not like superheroes. He's grown to really hate superhero comics, and that's why he didn't want to be credited.
Mm.
And maybe more than hating superheroes is he hates Hollywood. He
Mhm.
despises Hollywood. Like, yeah,
I've heard that. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
Two of his least favorite things coming together:
yeah.
his prior work and Hollywood.
But yeah, that's an interesting side note too. Like, basically, Alan Moore, who is a legendary comics creator, his greatest creation, the Watchmen, like he wants to have nothing to do with. So he's basically handed off the Watchmen to Dave Gibbons, who was the original artist on Watchmen. So Dave Gibbons is kind of the guardian of the property now.
Okay.
But yeah, pretty interesting behind the scenes there for sure.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of great little tidbits about Watchmen,
Yeah.
how it was made, and the legacy that it's left as well. So, all right. Well, I think with that, why don't we get into our ratings then? How how would you guys rate the Zack Snyder Watchmen movie? Um, I wouldn't want to start. Why don't you start, Porfirio? How did you feel about Watchmen?
Yeah, like I said, this was my first time watching it. I'm such a newbie when it comes to Watchmen, so obviously I don't have as much knowledge and background as you guys both do. But just in terms of the movie itself, without reading the comics or anything, I enjoyed it. I thought the themes were very heavy, really, the comics you guys said was created in the 80s?
Correct.
Yeah, 1986.
The 80s, and it's still, feel like just as relevant as it is today, you know? Um, and so I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good story, a good mystery story, a good there was a lot of great action scenes. I love the music choices that were in here. Um, and that twist at the end, I did not see that coming. So it was really good. I was entertained. So I say a 4 out of 5.
All right. All right, 4 out of 5. Well, how do you feel about Watchmen, Henry?
All right, the Watchmen movie. I'm gonna go with a 4 out of 5 also. Definitely enjoyed this movie back in 2009. Definitely enjoyed this movie on rewatching just recently. Um, yeah, this movie challenges you, like it does have a kind of frustrating ending where you're kind of confused and you're like, oh, did the good guys win or did they not win? Like, am I supposed to feel good about what's going on? I don't know. And it really does make you think about things, right? It's thought provoking, definitely thought provoking. And yeah, it's not perfect, but I really do think it's as good as it could have been. Like, Zack Snyder made a choice. He decided he really wanted to stick with the original material as closely as possible. And yeah, some of it came off as a little bit like too comic booky in a way. But ultimately it was like his vision and it was a great story. He put together a great story and it was very gripping. The characters are so fascinating in this one. Um, yeah, like the characters are fascinating and the way the story unfolds is really unique. Um, and yeah, again, I'll go back to how it challenges you, right? So like the comedian is a really interesting character in this movie. And I mentioned Jeffrey Dean Morgan is great in the role. But the comedian dies in like the first scene of the movie, right? So that's a little jarring, right? And the comedian is also a terrible person. You know, he's a rapist and he kills people and he murders like pregnant women and stuff. And like, um, but you can't help but like be completely consumed with his story, and you really want to know what he did and his backstory and his motivations and all that. So I mean, it's just good storytelling. It really is all throughout. So definitely recommend. And oh, you alluded to Legacy, Christian. Um, the comics, no question. We'll talk a little bit more about the comics later, but the movie I think has a big legacy too, because whereas the comics influenced comics forever, I think the same could be said about this movie and movies in general, right? Movies and TV, where there's like before the Watchmen 2009 movie and after, right? After there was a maturing of superhero content in movies and TV, right? So we keep mentioning The Boys, like The Boys wouldn't exist without Watchmen, right? There is a lot of influence, and it's obvious, right? Yeah, I mean, I can like hear the pitch meetings in my brain, right? It's like, oh, we're gonna do Watchmen, but it's funny. You know, it's like a funny version of Watchmen. Like I'm sure like there were pitches that went just like that for the Boys TV show, yeah. Um, and then this whole idea of villains um who have a lot of gray area, right? I think we've touched upon it quite a bit already, but look at the MCU, like characters like Thanos or like Killmonger or like the Scarlet Witch, where like they were straight up villains of Marvel movies, but there's a lot of sympathy for them, right? You understand why they do what they do, and in some ways, some people actually like side with those villains. Yeah, like the debate we had, not so much a debate, the conversation we had about Ozymandias earlier. Those same conversations have happened with the characters I just mentioned: Killmonger, Thanos, Scarlet Witch, and I think we can owe a lot of that sort of superhero storytelling to Watchmen. Yeah, Watchmen kind of opened our eyes up to that sort of thing, where supervillains don't necessarily need to be like 100% evil and despicable and like everyone's rooting for the good guys, right? It is interesting when there is gray area. And we see gray area with the villain here, Ozymandias. We see gray area with the heroes of the story, with every character in this movie, yeah. So it's that gray area where it really lends to uh this sort of confrontational aspect I've been going back to a lot, where the movie challenges you. It really does challenge you, and it makes for a very compelling and interesting movie watching experience. No question. 4 out of 5.
Yeah, I think I'm also feeling a 4 out of 5 on this movie as well. I think you guys really hit the nail on the head. I think the movie is it brings up a lot of questions, makes you really think, and really like it subverts a lot of superhero tropes in ways in really interesting ways that you really don't expect. And I think watching just something as simple as watching the villain really win
Yeah.
is pretty big, and the implications of that, and the way it kind of connects to a lot of American politics and a lot of very real fears at the time that may have resurfaced today in very different ways. And while it's a comic made for the 80s, I think the movie really captures that so well and really makes it for a more modern audience. And I think you're right, Henry. This in a way, this movie kind of did really revolutionize superhero movies. I think like an R-rated while there was an R-rated superhero movie before this, Blade, I can't really think of any others off the top of my head. I guess Spawn, but Spawn was a massive flop, and
Yeah.
Blade was afraid to be a superhero movie. This is, these are capes in your face.
Yeah.
These are very much superhero movies, and you get that DC logo at the beginning.
Yep.
So, but it's R-rated, it's contemplative, it's different, and it doesn't really leave you with that feel good feeling. And I think while there are some problems with the adaptation, I think in the way an adaptation, some things that don't work or some things that just didn't age as well that I noticed coming back to it. I still think it is a great movie and definitely one worth watching, especially if you've been following superhero movies. So 4 out of 5. And well, I think with that, let's we always have a comic recommendation. Of course, the obvious is to read the comic. The comic is great. It is a very dense comic, and it definitely moves a lot slower and has a different ending, a slightly different ending, but I think it gets to a lot of the real fears of the people at the time. And I know you've read a lot more of the Watchmen comics, Henry. Any more you'd like to
hmm
recommend?
Yeah, sure. Sure. Real quick note on the original series. Famously, the Watchmen graphic novel is on Time's list of 100 best English language novels. And it is on Time's list of 10 best graphic novels. And it's the only comic book on both lists. Yeah. So just one publication's opinion, but it's kind of a big deal that it's like the only one on both lists. So it's sort of recognized as a triumph in comic storytelling, but also just American, or maybe American slash British literature. Yeah. So um, huge props and kudos for that, and deservingly too. I think it's great. Um, you know, it is 100% worth checking out, and a great companion piece to the movie. And yeah, like you're saying, Christian, I read a lot of other Watchmen related comics also. Um, a lot of good ones, yeah. The Rorschach series that came out a few years ago is really good. Um, there was a whole bunch of prequel series that came out a while ago, maybe 10-ish years ago. They were called the Before Watchmen comics. A lot of good ones in there. But I'm just going to shout out what I think is the best one. It's the Minutemen 6-issue series released in 2012 to 2013, written and is illustrated by the late great Darwin Cook, and it is really cool. Um, the Minutemen are in the Watchmen movie, but it's kind of like a blink and you'll miss them sort of thing. But they're basically the predecessors to the Watchmen, and yeah, they're hardly explored in the movie. I guess the most notable member of the Watchmen in the movie is the original Night Owl, right? Hollis Mason. So he's the guy, the older guy who um, the new Night Owl, Dan Dryberg, meets up with to talk about their glory years and all that. Um, but yeah, he was part of a whole uh, superhero team, the Watchmen, or no, the Minutemen. Yeah. And yeah, the comic series is great. It really goes deep on their story. Yeah, so highly recommend Minutemen.
Nice. Good
Yeah,
recommendation.
right on. Okay. Any last thoughts on anything related to Watchmen, guys?
Hmm. Nah, I don't think I have anything else. Do you have anything else, Porfirio?
No, I think I'm good.
I guess it might be worth noting that there is a new Watchmen animated movie just came out earlier
Oh,
this
yeah.
year, I believe. Yeah, it's like part one and two, and part two is next year. So I haven't seen it, but I definitely intend on checking both of them out.
Yeah, check it out. Oh, and I guess also watch the HBO series.
There you go.
Also fantastic.
Yes, yes, that's very good also.
I seen that. That was good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like anything related to Watchmen is at least interesting, at the very least. Yeah. Yeah, even Doomsday Clock, which I think I mentioned earlier, it's a bit uneven. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah, like it's kind of a follow-up to the original Watchmen series in a way, and it crosses over with uh, a lot of the DC, the proper DC universe, if you will. Yeah. So yeah, I guess one parting thought, it is interesting that they made the decision to make the Watchmen universe our universe, real life places, New York City and the DC universe we know is fictional cities like Metropolis or Gotham City, right? So um again, lending the story to be a little bit more on the realistic side. Like, what if superheroes were real and they actually lived in the places that we know and love, right? Like New York City. So, um, yeah, uh, definitely a franchise that dips a toe in reality and does question us, right? And I mentioned like I thought of COVID when thinking about the movie, right? So real life stuff does come up when you talk and think Watchmen. Yeah.
Yeah. Like like Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly. That too. All right, with that, we can wrap up the episode. This is farewell from Henry, Porfirio, and Christian.